I'd been at Stanford and then MIT and then Stanford and MIT, and then I went to Xerox. So that was my first 8 years of commercial work. But it was a pretty important place. It was Xerox PARC, and we were doing icons and mice and bitmap displays and sort of defining the future of office computers, as we called them. But it really was the future of what I now call interaction design. I'm trying to remember what we called it there. Office systems. It's pretty boring. So I was in a group that was hired not to invent stuff, but to test whether these clever inventions were going to work. So I did a whole study of what the icons should look like, or they'd already been decided that there were going to be icons and there was going to be a mouse. How many buttons should be on a mouse? So I was hired as a human factors engineer. There were 2 psychologists, 2 computer scientists, and a couple designers. So it was a nice interdisciplinary group. And we were trying to prove that some of these things worked and some didn't. How many buttons should be on a mouse? 1, 2, or 3? Some people put 5 buttons on a mouse. That worked good too. So we compromised on 2. 3 would have worked, but people were confused about what the 3rd button was for. So left button, right button. What should the icons look like? We did a whole series of tests on what the labels on the keyboard should be. How should you lay the keyboard out? It was all the practical human factors work. But it was driven by these people at PARC. We were in a separate division, and we were actually separated physically. We were in El Segundo, California. And we flew up to Palo Alto almost every week, which is fine because that's where my parents lived. So I was going back and forth. So for 6 years at Xerox, the first 3 years were all about refining the Xerox Star user interface. And that was foundational because the ACM, Association for Computing Machinery, had a human factors group. It was called Human Factors in Computing. And when the papers came in on the Xerox Star, the whole thing shifted to user interface design. That's the term that was, instead of human factors in computing, it was user interface design. So it shifted from being a psychologist group or a computer scientist group to being a design group. So I was important there for being on a committee that put together a curriculum. So if you're a computer science department, how do you deal with computer-human interaction? How do you deal with these human factors? And how do you incorporate design in that? So my big diagram of that field is what shaped that report. And we didn't call it interaction design, we called it human-computer interaction. So at the center is my little guy with a face and a hand. So there's input devices and display devices. And these diagrams came out of exactly what we were doing at Xerox. But there's a whole computer graphics field, and there's mechanical engineering, controls, human factors. Human factors is, some people call this human factors in computing. That's what it used to be called. Human factors is sort of old Air Force term. And I can tell you the whole history of human factors if you want to know it, from Henry Dreyfuss and True. And industrial designer. And ID stands for a lot of different things. But there's a sort of cognitive side of what's happening in your head and what the conceptual models are that you have. And then there's the sort of motor models of what do you do? How do you plan to do something? So there's mental models, we call them. And then there's displays and controls, input and output. This is a sort of computer theory. And then there's a whole layer of the social and political organizational. How do you organize studies? How do you organize organizations so that these computers can be part of them? So there's psychology, I'm trying to put, and computing. The whole notion of how do you understand systems and how do those impact people? And then here's how do you organize work. This is This is called machines or systems. Whole things are systems. So there was a report that we put together that had about 8 different areas, at least 6 anyway. And we listed recommended courses for each of the areas. And that was ACM, Chi, curriculum. And it was about 92 or 3. 92 is when Xerox Star came out. It was a lot long after that, 95, say. And this is the diagram I did for that committee, and I brought sort of design into it. This is after Xerox, and I think before interval research. Maybe it was 85. Xerox Star came out in 82, I think. Let's call this 85. We'll have to find the reference, 86. So one of my diagrams went into that report just as a way of organizing everyone. The psychologists and the engineers and the computer scientists could all agree that this is why we need the psychologists, this is why we need the designers, this is why we need the systems people, and this is why we need business. And so but we made sure that there was the sort of human in the center of it. There's outputs and inputs, and pardon my messy diagram. And so you see this diagram as a kind of system diagram in a lot of the things that I draw. And I think it was out of that report that people began calling it interaction design, although it was more likely the industrial designers because they liked the term, the initials ID.